Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Pep Organ. Today I'd like to talk about some sad news in the organ community, particularly related to the Macys store, the famous one, the Wanamaker Department Store in Philadelphia. If you haven't heard, they've just announced a few days ago that they're actually going to be closing their store, and the final day will be in March of this year. So that store, which has daily organ recitals, will be closed, and there'll be no longer a chance to hear the organ anymore. Now, this is a really significant organ because this is the largest pipe organ in the world, depending on how you measure it. Based on the number of ranks and the physical mass, the physical weight of the organ, it is the largest organ. It has the largest swell division and the largest pedal division, and has quite a minimal amount of unification. So you can either call it the largest or second largest organ in the world. And on top of that, it was a very loved organ by the community. This Wanamaker Department Store, of course, is very famous. It's known for being one of the first retail stores to really popularize the whole idea of retail. They were the first store to have price tags, something that we take for granted now. So it's very sad from all sorts of different stances that this store is closing down. But it's partly symptomatic of what's happened with the retail industry in general. Things are moving online, there's new alternative ways to do shopping, and so the traditional department store, these are actually closing down now. And the sad thing about this one, of course, is that we're going to lose access to the organ. I've never actually been there, but from what I've heard, it's a beautiful organ, and it's been much loved. They had daily recitals there, if I'm not mistaken. So people were doing their shopping and hearing this organ every day. If they were doing their shopping, they would go in and just have a listen to the instrument. And, essentially that's a free way of getting a concert. Quite a relaxing way to enjoy the organ as well. Not so much stuck in a concert hall, but, as you're walking around, it's really lovely. It's a really lovely idea. So what does this mean? And what's my take on the whole situation? Firstly, of course, it's very sad. It's sad that the opportunities to hear the organ are decreasing. Church attendance is going down, but then having organs in civic places or sort of commercial areas like department stores, if we're going to lose that too, then the organ continues to lose its popularity and its accessibility to the public. But there is something to think about with this news that the store is closing. First off, the big one, I think, is that giant organs are financially risky. Perhaps part of the reason that this Macys has to close is because it wasn't profitable, and that could be, part of the pie, part of the puzzle there is that the organ maintenance costs and restoration costs would be exorbitant. A regular department store doesn't have to pay millions of dollars for the upkeep of a musical instrument. It's just something that you don't have to think about most of the time. So there is a financial danger here where if you have a really large organ, we're talking some of the biggest in the world, it's really hard to keep them affordably maintained. The only way is to really have some kind of financial backing that isn't profit driven. So on that point, because we're talking about a very famous organ here that's potentially not going to be heard anymore, the survival of the organ has nothing to do with its fame. And this is true throughout the world. An organ can be as famous, every organist might know the name of a famous organ. That doesn't guarantee that it's going to survive and remain as a performing instrument. It might just sit idle, unplayed. So it's not actually the size or famousness of the organ that makes them survive. It's more about the institutions that support them. And this is my next point. It is the institutions themselves that are the best way to support the organ. If there's private home organs, one day that person who owns the home will die, and then maybe the next person doesn't really care about organs, or maybe they just, they don't care enough to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep it in good shape. So not individuals, obviously not places like retail, where there is sort of a direct correlation between the organ's ability to be used and the financial sort of revenue that it draws in. At the end of the day, with a few exceptions, organs aren't really a draw card. They don't make money themselves. They're something that you have to actually invest in and have patronage for. And that can come from individuals, of course, but long term, it really does have to come from institutions. So I'm talking about places like universities, places like civic spaces, town halls, and city halls. These spaces serve multiple purposes. There is a financial component to them. However, and particularly if they have heritage value and they are being appreciated by the community and are being used by the city or by the university, whatever it is, then the organ has a much greater likelihood of remaining in good condition, being restored, and the money being spent so that it can be played. So unfortunately, if there is an organ that's just purely for making money, it might one day just that whole industry might disappear. And that's what we've seen with retail. That's what we've seen with a number of different things. Of course, that's what we've seen with the theatre organs, which is these organs completely tied to the ability to make money for silent films in the 1920s and 30s. That whole industry just collapsed almost overnight, and that meant that the organs themselves, they weren't going to survive. There wasn't. I mean, people loved them. Don't get me wrong. People loved hearing the theatre organs, but as soon as that financial incentive that the organ directly is correlated to the amount of money that you can make for your cinema, then it's gone. It's basically not going to survive. And some get moved around and they might have a second life doing something else, but the sort of commercial loss there is why thousands of organs have been destroyed from theatres. Some other point I'll make about the Macys organ, and perhaps controversial, but I do think that some organs are just too big, right? So if the organ costs so many millions of dollars to keep in good shape, is it really worth it? I mean, it might have been a great vanity project back when it was built, maybe in the 1930s, it was an achievement to build the largest organ in the world. But you may have noticed that the largest organ in the world still comes from the 1930s, the Boardwalk Auditorium. These organs of that size are not being built anymore. There are some that are approaching that size, and maybe if you've got an institution and a lot of money to spend, then you can build that. But you have to think about the longer term here. It just isn't as desirable to keep an organ in good shape, especially, imagine just you're a manager, maybe you're just the person responsible for finance of your building, and you realize that the organ is taking up more and more percentage points of your overall maintenance costs that are interrupting, practically they're interrupting with the ability to keep the ceilings intact, to stop water leaks, to keep the paint from, having to repaint the building, all the other costs, lifts, maintenance, all those things, safety. The organ's just going to cut into all that, and it becomes hard to justify. And in some cases, like even the Sydney Town Hall organ, the largest organ in the world in 1890, and certainly one that can be serviceable, but even at that size, 5 manuals and the number of stops that it has, it's not always fully working. It's just hard generally to keep an organ of a great size in fully working condition, keep it in tip-top shape. So there is a little bit of pragmatism that's necessary here in the building of large organs, thinking about, yes, maybe we can fund this in the next 10 years, but can we, over the next 100 years, continue to have a tradition where the organ is being maintained and being valued? The last thing I want to say is that it is true that the Macys organ in Philadelphia is historically protected. It has a historical protection, but what does that actually mean for the access to the organ? Quite often historical protection typically doesn't include the requirement for the organ to be performed on, just that it's maintained. So, basically these big institutions will get a slap on the wrist if the organ is not in playable condition. So they will have to spend a couple $1 million, and they really don't want to, but they spend it, and then they have to keep the organ conditional and working. But they don't care about the organ. They're only putting out that money so that they can keep the building itself. And so one thing that's really important with these sort of historical listings is that the organ component has a requirement to be performed on. This is not architecture that just sits there and people walk by and they can appreciate it. It has to be heard. The organ is part building, but it's all about the sound. And so you have to have some kind of requirement in there that the organ actually gets used. There's one instance locally, for instance, at Sydney, the State Theatre has a beautiful State Theatre organ. It has a Wurlitzer. You can actually go onto my YouTube channel and find the video of me performing on that a few years ago. To this day, that's the only performance, I think, this whole century that organ has had to a general audience. Other than that, it's just been getting maintained, tuned, serviced. It's because the building itself doesn't care about the organ, but they have a historical mandate that, the heritage value that the organ must be maintained. So look, that's not serving anyone. It's not doing anything good for anyone. Of course, by maintaining it, it does mean that the organ will continue to survive, and maybe one day, could be in 30 years, could be in 100 years, the organ will be ready to play, and finally someone who appreciates it can revive the instrument. But, it's not doing people like us, who are living in the present day, much good to have an organ that's just unused. So that's my last take. I think that we don't know for sure what's going to happen to the Macys. It's obviously the organ is protected there, so it will be maintained, but whether it gets heard again, obviously it's very unlikely there'll be daily concerts anymore until something new happens to the building. I've heard something about it turning into commercial sort of office space, and maybe the organ has to be part of that in some way, but as you can tell, it's not ideal. And so we do need to think about how we preserve our organs by maintaining them, but requiring that they also be heard. So a bit of sad news today, but thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll be back for more soon. Thanks for watching.